I have the energy flowing.
I think it should have better.
Well, hello, welcome everyone. My name is Tatiana Berger and I teach in the Graduate Architecture and the Neuroscience for Architecture Certificate program here at the New School of Architecture and Design in San Diego. I would like to welcome all of you to the second lecture of this Colloquium series. We have a full room today and there are 100 people watching the live stream all around the world. So thank you all for joining us this morning. The Frontiers Colloquium is part of our year-round educational and research program. We aim to present to you the most current research in neuroscience for architecture and design. The lectures and debates are always free and open to students, faculty, staff, and the general public. And we begin in the early afternoon to allow our followers outside of the US to join us in real time. The Colloquium series leads up to our summer executive course in neuroscience for architecture and design, where Dr. Gepshtein will also lecture. This summer course will be held this summer from August 13th to the 17th here at the New School in San Diego. Please see our website and the ANFA website later next month for the full schedule, the roster of presenters, and details about how to register for the course. We held our first executive course last summer, and it was very successful with over 30 participants from over 9 countries. We had architect Stephen Holt from New York and Juhani Palasma from Helsinki, Finland, and we expect a similar lineup this coming summer. So Sergei Gepshtein probably doesn't need much of an introduction since this lecture has already generated such great interest, but here are a few major points from his extensive biography. Dr. Sergei Gepshtein is a scientist working in the areas of perceptual psychology and sensory neuroscience. He is a member of the Center for Neurobiology of Vision at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in La Jolla, California, where he studies boundaries of perception in the natural world and in immersive media. He also directs the Collaboratory for Adaptive Sensory Technologies at the Salk Institute. Before joining the Salk Institute, Dr. Gepshtein investigated stereoscopic vision and interaction of vision and haptic sense at the University of California, Berkeley. He then studied computational principles of sensory perception and visually guided action at RIKEN Brain Science Institute in Japan. Throughout his career, Dr. Gepshtein has remained committed to research of perceptual organization, which is a field of neuroscience and mathematical psychology originated from the Gestalt school of thought. He's the recipient of multiple research awards and grants. He's a founding member of the World Building Institute and the founding director of the Center for Spatial Perception and Concrete Experience, or SPACE, both at the University of Southern California. Sergei joined the ANFA Board of Directors in 2016, and he co-teaches a seminar in neuroscience for architecture here at the New School of Architecture and Design. So let's welcome Sergei.
Tatiana, thank you so much for this introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for coming to this lecture, and for all of you out there in the cloud watching. Today I'm going to talk about one interesting question on the juncture of these two fields of architecture and neuroscience. But before I go into any of that, I want to have you answer a couple of questions. I like to start my lectures from learning a little bit what my audiences think about this. So I'll give you a couple of questions and I'll ask you to please write down the answers. And then I'll ask you to volunteer and give me your answers, and there we'll start our conversation. There will be an hour of sort of interactive lecture, and then there will be a debate or discussion. So if you have questions emerging in the middle of my talk, please write them down. We'll have the time to address them afterwards. My question will have to do with the definition of one foundational concept in our language and our perception of the world. I will ask you to please tell me what you think the category of that term is. So when I'm trying to define something, such as my glasses or myself, I would start with a category. The glasses, for example, is an optical device, or myself is a biological organism, a human being. These are two examples of large categories of optical devices, of human beings. I'll ask you to please write down the category for what I will ask you, and then consider whether the answer will depend on whether or not you are an architect. My question will be, what is space? I will ask you to please define space very briefly, or tell me what the category of space is in a way that no one will be able to doubt your definition. This is my first question. And the second question is whether or not you think your answer will depend on your profession. I'll give you a minute. Twenty seconds to go. You're fast. Time. Okay. Now, please don't write anymore. The time is over. Sorry. Now, please, would you please volunteer? Anybody? How would you answer the first question, please? Anybody?
The environment supporting human functions.
Space is environment. The category is environment.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. It's a very interesting and important aspect of space, I would say. Please, another one.
I also said environment
as a category.
Yeah, one of the two dimensions, space and time, which the entire universe exists, but also it's a medium.
So from what you said, I infer that you think space is a dimension.
Yeah.
You sneaked in another definition, which was a dimension. Environment and dimension. You seem to agree. And here is the third.
I said it was place.
Place.
Place where there's a there, something's happening.
Place where something is happening. It's like a stage, a theatrical stage. Please, one more.
I couldn't decide between macro and micro, so I said poetically, all there is between all it is.
Here is an example of poetical space, poetic space. Poetics of space, Gaston Bachelard. Please, last volunteer, Marvin. Space is movement.
The dancer on stage, if they're just in one place, it's a point. And then if they begin to move, they begin to be defined by their capabilities. And it brings back Paul Klee, point, line, plane moves to space, just like continuing to extend one figure.
Very interesting. And I presume you're an architect. And you use theater to explain what space is. But that's very interesting. Thank you. So we have a number of definitions, and I'm sure every one of you, given some more time, would come up with other definitions. Now, do you think your definition depends on whether or not you're an architect? So we saw an architect trying to define space by bringing in a theatrical example.
Yes.
So what the difference would be? Let me just ask you two more questions about that, and then we'll delve into my slides. Why do you think architects think differently?
I think about the function and the form and the aesthetic at the same time. So there was a strong functional component in my definition.
Functional.
Environment supporting activities, human being activities.
Mm-hmm. So architect would have different functions in mind, as opposed to theater producer, director, or filmmaker.
Probably.
Please.
I'm thinking as architects, we want to contain the dimension. So we think that this perception is from the human being perspective, container spaces, an extension for selves, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So we're thinking of how to use what we contain.
Yeah, so you make distinction between a general humanistic approach to space and the professional one. So I think the larger question that emerges from this is whether or not there is a single space, or there are many spaces, or maybe there is a single space, an ultimate space for which we sample our definitions. We come up with multiple concepts of space, depending on who we are, maybe differently at different points in our lives. So to introduce certain approach to this question at the juncture of neuroscience and architecture, I would like to start with this sequence of images. I just took my iPhone and walking down this section of the Salk Institute, I just took a sequence of images. So here I'm moving and I'm turning slightly to the left. Okay, so I could play it faster so you could see it as if it were a movie. So what I'm presenting to you is my experience of space, more or less, from a point of view of a single eye. Suppose this is a sequence of images that are produced by an environment on my retina, in my eye, and from that I infer what we call space. I would argue that space as such is not given to us directly. Our experience of space is a construct. And everything that you said about space is probably correct, but these are all interpretations of this construct. And when I ask you about space, your answer is filtered through layers and layers of culture and thinking about what space is. So your answers are mostly intellectual. This is the space of intellect. In order to address this question at the juncture of neuroscience and architecture, I want to start from pointing out the vast difference between the perspectives on what space is from the point of view of an individual, from the first person perspective, which you have just taken in those images, in the point of view of science, which is intrinsically third person perspective. First person means my approach from my personal point of view, how it appears to me. And the area of knowledge, which is specializing in experience from the first person perspective, is called phenomenology. Let me put it on the board here. It's an area of science, of philosophy, depending on where you're coming from, phenomenology. Phenomena. Phenomena is the term reserved for appearances, as opposed to noumena in Kantian philosophy. If you're familiar with Kant, Kant made the distinction between things in themselves, which are not given to our experiences in any way, and appearances of objects are phenomena. So phenomenology is a discipline having to do with how things appear to me, as opposed to what they really are, which we don't know, really. According to Kant, we would never know it, but the scientists would tell you that using their methodologies, using the scientific method, empirical method of posing hypotheses and testing them, they come up with understanding of things out there in the world, which is not how they appear to us, but how they really are. So this is a radically different perspective, and to represent it, I want to describe the entire sort of tree of knowledge in this way, and conversation that we may have between different disciplines are sort of links we make between different branches of this tree. So if you are a lighting designer or architect or city planner, you will understand other city planners, or maybe if you're a city planner, you're an architectural lighting designer, much better than if you talk to a scientist. And I could talk to a scientist and immediately understand what they're talking about, maybe faster than if I talk to an architect, because our presupposition of basic ideas of what space is, what experience is, are very similar within sciences or within humanities or within architecture. So when we are going to talk about architecture and neuroscience, we find ourselves on very different branches of this tree, which are represented by these remote red dots. I've been trying to do that for a number of years, and I discovered that it is much more difficult to establish this connection, to understand each other across disciplines, than to actually describe any specific content. So I could talk about structure of the brain or experiments in psychophysics only after I establish some common ground with you. And to do that, I believe it is important to find a common source, a common sort of starting point, which is represented here as this, I think I have this pointer, which is represented here as this point where the two branches, in neuroscience and architecture, are diverging. Or we could even look deeper at one of the fundamental concepts from every area of knowledge stems, and that area, that concept of space, I think, is a good example of a fundamental notion that embraces every domain of knowledge, including architecture and neuroscience. But it happens that even there we find important distinctions. And here is one example. I'll give you an illustration from a phenomenologist, philosophical phenomenologist, Jan Patočka, who put it this way in 1936. He said, modern man, and I apologize, by man he means the entire humankind. He meant, of course, a human being. Modern man has no unified worldview. He lives in a double world. At once, in his own naturally given environment, and in a world created for him by modern natural science, based on the principle of mathematical laws governing nature. The disunion that has thus pervaded the whole of human life is the true source of our present spiritual crisis. It is understandable that life is the true source of our present spirit. It is understandable that thinkers and philosophers have often attempted somehow to overcome it. Yet they have generally gone about this in a way meant to eliminate one of the two terms, to logically reduce one to another, to present one, usually on the basis of causal argument, as a consequence and a component of the other. So even there, when we talk about very basic concepts, somehow we come from one perspective or another, and I would argue that these perspectives have to do with taking the first-person view of the world or the third-person view of the world. To understand the distance, I would like to draw this ladder of disciplines. I mentioned phenomenology, which is a field of knowledge having to do with the first-person perspective. This is first person. And the ultimate third-person discipline, of course, is physics, from physis, for nature. I'll put physics down here. By the way, do you know why we usually, when we talk about ideas, we put them up, and we talk about matter, we put them down? Is that the case that we presume that if heavy things would fall, they would sort of descend even on this board? I think it's an important question, but I will not talk about it right now. Gravity, yes. Physics is heavy, and phenomenology is light. It's lofty, it's effervescent. I'll return to this question. It turns out to be an important question. Please remind me if I forget in the end of this conversation. So we have phenomenology, which is entirely about first-person perspective, and we have physics, which is entirely about third-person perspective. Third person. And this boundary, the spiritual crisis that Patočka is talking about, is dividing our ways of thinking about the world to camps. here in between, I would put neuroscience as a branch of third world perspective, third person perspective, third person world. Because in the sciences, our goal is to describe things objectively, to remove any trace of subjectivity. Maybe it's not possible entirely, but we try to do that to the limit. We try to be objective as much as possible. And this is a branch of neuroscience which is concerned primarily with this boundary between third person and first person perspectives. And that is called psychophysics, sensory psychophysics. So here is a ladder of disciplines that specialize in trying to understand different levels of connection between the two worlds. It so happens that all this is developed pretty well. We have a sophisticated science of physics and neuroscience and psychophysics. But on the side of phenomenology, we have elaborate speculations. We have a sophisticated language for talking about it, but we don't have something that sciences give us. We don't have predictive powers. So let me try to see how to derive such predictive powers, because I assume that an architect or designer of any kind, lighting designer, or theater designer, or cinematic designer, will want to know how his constructs, his designs will be experienced, which becomes particularly important today when we have these technologies that allow us to experience three-dimensional environments, such as virtual reality, augmented reality, in a way that we couldn't do it before in the early days of any of the disciplines that I mentioned. So I suppose you remember this film from 1999, Being Joel Malkovich. This is a unique journey into the mind of a person. You are taking the first-person view of John Malkovich in this film, and now I want to invite you into the head of another person, an important German physicist, Ernst Mach. Ernst Mach was a philosopher and a scientist and a physicist. He made important contributions to physics, but also to neuroscience and to psychology of experience. And one of the things he did is trying to understand what it is to experience the world from the first person point of view. Here's the drawing he made on the right. It was published in 1897. So he's trying to describe how the world appears to him before he imposes any intellectual content on it. You could read this description at your leisure, but essentially he makes points like, I see my body as if I see a body of another person, and this body happens to have no head, which is strange, but we're used to it, which is why we don't pay attention to this fact. Following this line of argument, you may notice that, for example, when you're looking at the world from the left eye, you see the left side of your nose all the time. You could check it right now. But you're not aware of your nose. These are elements of experience that interest phenomenologists or other researchers of first-person world of view. Now, this is the end of the 19th century. And the idea was, it was just before Gestalt psychology was invented. This was one of the attempts to describe the world and build science from this description. Later, in the middle of 20th century, another important psychologist, he performed this similar exercise. His name is James Gibson. You could see his image. Many of you have heard of him. He was actually trained in the circle of Gestalt psychologists early on. And then he was invited to devise methods for military pilots, to improve methods for military pilots to land their planes. And there he was very interested in the first person perspective, because he was trying to understand how the rapid change of the environment allows you to figure how to align the plane. It turns out that academic psychology of the time was not helpful in that respect. He had to invent an entire new language for for this question. And he also started from the first person perspective. And here's a series of images that he drew, similar to Mach's images. Mach was his inspiration. And the difference is that he is more interested in the change. Here we see his room as he is rotating his head to the right. So here is the 3 frames, and here is how he describes it. As he moves his head roughly 90 degrees to the right, the world is moving relative to him. And notice, for example, let's see this landmark. Yeah, let's see, I'm pointing at this series of objects, these trees or buildings, not clear, but there are some objects out there you could see through the window, and as he moves his head, those images are changing their position in the field of view. Here they're in the center, here to the left, and here farther to the left. This is a transformation to which we are used, but we interpret it as our motion and not the motion of the environment. So our mind automatically, or our brain, automatically makes the transformation. We divide the changes that are presented to us by the world to the changes induced by me, by moving my head or moving my eyes, and the changes that happen out there in the world. So here is one example of differences between the 2 perspectives. And these are fundamental, because from the third point perspective, or from third person perspective, you experience the world as you think about it from the third person point of view. You experience the world as stationary. You can imagine yourself walking in the environment, and the environment is stationary, and your position relative to the environment is changing. But what is given to you directly is this. So this transition from the first person view to the third person view happens automatically and instantaneously in your brain, so that the first person view is not really accessible to us unless we do analysis of this kind that Mach and Gibson underwent through in a series of very interesting studies. So in the end, by roughly mid-20th century, this division became very clear, but it was investigated mostly by the phenomenologists, so phenomenological philosophers, as opposed to scientists. And I'll give you a few examples of that. Here is Merleau-Ponty, which is an important French phenomenologist who was interested in scientific psychology, in Gestalt psychology in particular, but he remained true to philosophy, and here is how he described this juncture that we are talking about. So I'll quote Merleau-Ponty: "The world of perception, or in other words, the world which is revealed to us by our senses in everyday life, seems at first sight to be one of the seems to be the one we know best of all. We need neither to measure nor to calculate in order to gain access to this world, and it would seem that we can fathom it simply by opening our eyes and getting on with our lives. Yet this is a delusion. The world of perception is, to a great extent, unknown territory, as long as we remain in the practical or utilitarian attitude." He's trying to say essentially that when we are thinking about the world, we automatically take third-person point of view. But as a designer of experience, perhaps you want to better understand the first-person point of view, and that's, I think, what he means when he talks about this utilitarian or practical attitude. Every designer of spatial experience wants to take this practical attitude, but the first-person world is not really understood. It's sort of unknown territory. And he mentions that this is one of the great achievements of modern art and philosophy. He doesn't talk about science yet, to allow us to rediscover the world in which we live, yet which we're always prone to forget. And then Merleau-Ponty turns to space, our question today. He is trying to make distinction between 2 kinds of space. The space that here he calls the space of classical science, and I would call it the space of intellect, because it's always filtered through our abstract reasoning about space. He says about the space of classical science, it is the uniform medium in which things are arranged in 3 dimensions and in which they remain the same regardless of the position they occupy. It's a medium of simultaneous objects capable of being apprehended by an absolute observer who is equally close to them all, a medium without point of view, without body, and without spatial position, in sum, the medium of pure intellect. This is the third person world. And he contrasts this with the space of experience in which our relationship to space is not that of pure disembodied subject to a distant object, but rather that of a being which dwells in space relating to its natural habitat. So this is one of the best illustrations by a phenomenologist of this distinction between 2 worlds. Back to our question in the beginning, when I asked you about how would you define space and whether you think the definition depends on your profession, I think we could, from this perspective, we could summarize this by saying that indeed there are more than one worlds and there are more than one spaces, at least 2. Within each of them, you could find multiple subcategories, but by and large, I would make the distinction between the space of intellect and space of experience. The space of intellect is explored by different branches of physics. Here is in geometry, philosophy, in cosmology, etc. And the other one is the space of experience, the space of intellect and space of experience. And here is a review of the phenomenologically given space and place. Someone mentioned, it was Humarin, trying to describe space as place. Phenomenologists make a very sharp distinction between space and place, and they make it in a very interesting way for the history, reviewing the distinction for the history of thinking about space. So this is the source for insight about this. Here is a study of how different languages represent space differently. This is in case of Greek. Gave us much of the terminology that we use today when we talk about space and place and science. Here is Merleau-Ponty's view, which I cited. Here is another source, a very interesting book by Rudolf Arnheim, a historian and psychologist of science, whose view is derived mainly from Gestalt psychology. And here is a modern view called Visuality for Architects, trying to convince the reader that beyond semantic and linguistic and sort of post-structuralist, etc. concepts of space, it's important to remember that there is direct visual space that we sort of forget about, just like Merleau-Ponty mentioned. So these are the 2 spaces, I would say. One is the space of intellect, and the other is space of experience. And we have a sophisticated, beautiful, mathematically elaborate science of intellect, and we have beautiful descriptions, but no predictive powers about space of experience. And what I want to accomplish is to understand how to approach the space of experience from a point of view that would allow us to make predictions, to understand it, maybe at the level of certainty that we have in the sciences. So the goal is to develop a scientific approach to experience of space. But here, immediately, just think about it. We want to understand experience of space, which is a first-person point of view, using scientific tools, which are third-person. So how can we do that? How can we develop a science, a third-person account of something which is inherently first-person? That's a tricky business, which is why we have a number of specialized areas of knowledge that are trying to do that. And I mentioned psychophysics here. Psychophysics is a science invented by a German physicist, Gustav Fechner, in middle 19th century, with the goal of understand mental qualities, psychic activities, as he called them, from the point of view of third-person science. But there is another science which approaches this boundary from above, so to speak. And that is so-called experimental phenomenology. So here is the missing link. Let's go. It's experimental phenomenology. Experimental phenomenology. So this juncture is very important for our goal of understanding space of experience in scientific terms, because there are two specialized areas of knowledge already there with the concepts, the languages. It just so happens that they use very obscure, I would say, terminology, because whether you approach this boundary from above or from below, you enter a domain which is not given to you directly. It's not the language of traditional science, and it's not the language of traditional phenomenology that they had to come up with in order to make some progress there. Gestalt psychology is one of the branches of what we call experimental phenomenology. So from now on, I will refer to this as Gestalt approach and to this as psychophysics or sensory psychophysics. And the significance of this convergence of these two disciplines of Gestalt psychology and psychophysics is important even more from the point of view of Patočka, for example. Remember, I mentioned this crisis, the spiritual crisis that we, in the broader culture, we don't have a picture of the world which is unified. We have sort of two disjoint views of the world. Maybe in the broader cultural context, this juncture of Gestalt and psychophysical approaches will allow us for the first time to create this bridge, to build a bridge between the two domains. So this conversation that we have today is important not only for the juncture of architecture and neuroscience, but maybe in a much broader context of our culture. So here I will, this is the end of first part of my lecture, just defining the problem. And I think I convinced you that there is a problem there. And now I wanted to talk about approaches, several approaches to this question from the point of view of first-person perspective, Gestalt psychology and phenomenology, and from the point of view of third-person science. So here is a drawing reproduced in the book by Arnheim, whom I mentioned. The drawing is by an Italian architect, Paolo Portoghesi. As I mentioned, Arnheim was trained by Gestalt psychologists in Germany. He became one of the prominent thinkers in American academia. But here in this book, published in 1977, he uses drawing by an architect in order to explain what it means to experience space. And it happens to be experience of architectural settings, a built environment of some sort where thick lines represent, say, walls. Suppose you're in a garden, and the thick walls represents walls of the garden, and you're, this red dot is you're walking around. You pass between these walls, you walk around, and the thin lines represent the effect that the parts of built environment exert on you. The person having first-person experience of these settings. Here is how Arnheim describes this. He says, in perceptual experience, the spaces surrounding buildings cannot be considered empty. Instead, these spaces are pervaded by visual forces generated by architectural structures and determined by the size and the shape of their generators. So he thinks of these walls, of physical structures, as sources of information that is sort of sent out in the world, and you, the person walking around, are sort of subjecting yourself to these forces. He described these forces as follows. Visual forces must be understood as components of perceptual fields that surround buildings. The fields, of course, are represented by these concentric circles. A field of visual forces, he says, expands from the center and propagates its way from as far into the environment as its strength permits. So each of these generators of these physical objects sends out information, and the distance to which it sends, or the intensity, depends on the strength of the generator. That's the language that Arnheim uses. So this is an example, as I mentioned, of a phenomenal account from the first person point of view. And I discover, as I talk to architect, that this, let me go back to this slide, that this account is similar to how architects describe experiences today. That is, I think Arnheim is true to architectural discourse. Just another day I had a conversation with an architect, Italian architect, and she told me that she had experience of, in a museum of a statue, a large statue, and she felt pressure. It was large. It was a large statue, and she was talking about the pressure that she felt from that object, from this physical object. Of course, this is not a physical pressure. The light reflected from surfaces of this physical object would not exert on her more pressure than light from some other object. This is a construct that she evoked in order to explain her experience. This is similar to what Arnheim is talking about, and probably what Portuguese was trying to represent. But of course, this is not a scientific account of what happens, because scientifically, we don't experience this perceptual field directly. What we experience at every position in that field is something generated by specific image projected into our eyes from the environment. And as you move through the environment, you have sequences of these images. So the idea of perceptual field is a suspect from the scientific point of view. And what is visual force? And is it something that can be measured? If we could measure those, if we had the power to actually measure the strength of those generators and the change from one location to another, maybe we would have a beginning of a science of experience. So what I'm going to do is to take a step back here into psychophysics and try and figure how to capture this subjective, phenomenological, first-person account in scientific terms. And maybe that exercise will give us the beginning of a science of experience, as opposed to the science of space outside of the experience. So our goal, in other words, is to measure the structure of subjective spatial experience by objective means, so we can model and predict it. My starting point will be from here, the neuroscience. I'll come to psychophysics from neuroscience. This is an illustration, a textbook illustration of organization of information in the brain. It's called somatosensory homunculus. So what you see here, this is a section of the brain. This is the back of the brain. This is front of the brain. The section is represented by this slice of glass running through the brain. And if you're looking on this glass from the back, right here, so from the back of the brain forward, you would see that different parts of the slice represent different parts of your skin. Essentially, what you have in this part of the brain is a map of your skin, of your entire body. And you will notice immediately by examining this map that different amount of neural tissue, different number of neurons, cells of the brain, are allocated to different parts of your skin. It's as if the brain is trying to allocate more of its resources, more of neurons, to parts of your skin which are more important, such as your face or lips, as opposed to, say, the elbow. So the brain allocates more resources where the resources are important for high sensitivity. Makes perfect sense. The brain is a good economist. Here is another illustration of the same idea. It's a three-dimensional representation of that map. It's called somatosensory homunculus, as I mentioned. So you see the hands are much larger than some other parts of the body, and lips are very large. It's funny because it's so grotesquely disproportionate, but that's what that part of your brain thinks, so to speak, about what's important in terms of your sensitivity. This is just an illustration that the brain is selective, and it's selective for economical reasons. Neural resources are important, they're expensive, so the brain, being a good economist, is locating more resources where they're useful, which is why we are selective in every sense, not only in sensations on your skin, tactile sense in this case. Here is an illustration of what it means for perception of visual information. And I want to introduce it using this work of art by Salvador Dali. This painting is called, I don't have the time to read the title of the painting, please read the title, but essentially this is an example of how the same object could send different information out there in the world. And because of the selectivity of your brain, you would pick different messages from different locations. So here, if you're near the painting, if you happen to be in the museum and approach the painting, it's a very large canvas, you will notice there's a woman here in the center, and she's surrounded by something that looks like blocks. So when you're near the painting, you receive one message, which I just described. If you walk away from that painting, you'll see something like this. And this is the same thing blurred. Yeah, you will see a face of one of our beloved presidents. So here is another message that you receive from the same object. This is work of art, but I think it's a good illustration of a fundamental principle, that the same object could send information, different kinds of information into space. So imagine if you are in the museum and you are facing that painting, you're free to walk back and forth in front of the painting. And this is the plan view from above, just like in that drawing by Portuguese, a few slides up. So you are here in the space, and here is the area from which you would experience one message, the woman. And here is the part of space in which you experience the president. So here's an example of how space is partitioned by what you can experience from different locations. And here you're standing here, the red dot, you're always the red dot, and you're walking, and here you see the president, and here you see the woman. You have a sequence of experiences. If we knew how to build such a map for any environment, we would accomplish something remarkable. We would have a beginning of predictive framework for understanding experience in the built environment. And if you're an architect and you want to design certain experiences in a large structure, in a courtyard or around the building or inside the building, you would be able to predict experience from every location if you had such a map. Rather than present a canonical view to a client and leave the rest sort of to client's imagination, you would have the power to have a comprehensive picture of the experience of that environment. And given that map, you would move things around. Perhaps you had a plugin in your software that would allow you to build such a map. You would move walls around and you would change your design such as to make experience satisfactory at every location. So to summarize briefly, I'm getting at the question of a third-person account of first-person subjective experience. And my starting point is that the brain is selective, which is a fact from neuroscience, which is a third-person science, right? It's an objective account of the brain and maybe some aspects of experience. And from that selectivity of the brain, I'm trying to infer a structure of experience, something that will be useful to researchers of experience or architects or anybody who is designing experience and is interested in the practical and utilitarian aspect of it, as Merleau-Ponty said. So here is, when I talk about this, I always show this image. This is a scene from Venice, and imagine you're moving down that canal, and what you will experience different parts of the scene presented to you, just like different images in Dali's painting present different information to you depending on where you are. This real three-dimensional scene or piece of the world will present you different information depending on where you are. So as you move through this space, you subject yourself to different experiences, and maybe now we could try and map it out. So the starting point is to say select a number of what they call features of the environment. I don't care about the experience of every part of it. Let's select a number of features and try to map things out. So these features, for example, here I selected two. They happen to be closer to you as opposed to those features which are farther away. And what you notice that the features that are closer by, they're given to you in your direct experience in a different quality, right? So these features near and those far, they have different density, right? Those which are farther away are normally presented to you in high density. Things that are farther away appear to be smaller and sort of they're closer by. The psychologist James Gibson, whom I mentioned above, was one of the first researchers who explored that. He called that gradient of texture. Texture, of course, texture is sort of collection of little elements, and gradient of texture is the change in the density of these elements as a function of distance. Here, I'm not capturing the entire texture. I'm only talking about some parts of that texture from near a distance and from a long distance. To understand the effect on your perception in terms of your selectivity, how you can see some features from some distance and other features from another distance, it's important to remember that our brains, for a sighted individual, different features are represented in different maps. Just like in the map of your skin in somatosensory homunculus, in your brain, on the back of the brain, in the so-called occipital cortex, you have maps of the world at different density of detail, so to speak. In the scientific language, density of detail is called spatial frequency. High frequency where density is high, and low frequency where density is low. But for now, I will talk about just density of detail. So here's an example of this map. From the same scene shown here, we have the map of a high frequency or high density, and here is the map on the bottom of low density. And you will see that in the low density map, some high density features are lost. For example, branches of the tree are invisible, and they're very well visible here, and vice versa. The gross sort of the gist, the gestalt of the scene is given to you much better in the low density map than in a high density map. To capture this, in the laboratory, we usually use much simplified patterns, not images of cities, but something that's called luminance gray. Here is an example of such a grating, and this is the case where the density of detail is varying from low on the left to high on the right. So this is a smooth transition from low density to high density, from left to right. So in this direction, only the density is changing. In this direction, only the contrast is changing. Contrast is the difference between high intensity and low intensity part of any image. So here on the bottom, the contrast is high, and here it is low. So essentially, this is a map of density of detail in 2 dimensions. And what you notice by examining this map is that the boundary between visible and invisible depends on the density of detail. So for every horizontal location, starting here, for example, you can go up and examine how far you can see this bar. So here you can see from where I am now, I can see that it ends here on the left side, and I see the bars extending high up in the middle, and again lower on the right. So here is an attempt to draw the boundary between visible and invisible. And of course, this happens because of the selectivity of your brain. The brain allocates its resources to different densities of detail differently, which is why you can see the detail differently. So below this curve is called contrast sensitivity function, technically. That's really important. What matters is that we know what this boundary is. In the science of psychophysics here, on the third person point of view, we developed a detailed description of that boundary. We know what it is for different densities of detail, not only for gratings, but for a variety of different images. And we have a mathematical formulation for it, so that if you wanted, we could make predictions for any feature in the environment where the boundary of visibility is. To illustrate that, suppose I consider only low contrast here. So according to this curve, I would expect that my image would be invisible here at low contrast. It will be visible here and invisible here. So suppose if I showed you just a single image with a fixed density of detail and move it away from you. Moving away means that the density of detail in projection into your eye would increase. So you would travel along this line left to right, like this. So here is the image with fixed density of detail, and I move it away from you, and on the right, you'll see its projection into your eye. So the contrast of the pattern is fixed, and the density of detail is changing as if I'm traveling along that line here, along this dashed line and on top. And I present this on the bottom graphically. And this window of visibility, the range of densities which are visible to you would correspond to range of distances in three dimensions where it is visible. So here is an example of how, from my detailed understanding of the boundary of visibility derived in the laboratory, I can predict what part of space will give me access to that feature. It doesn't really matter whether I'm stationary and that part of the world is moving relative to me, or the part of the world is stationary and I am moving relative to it. Now I can predict a part of the world where that feature will be visible. I will call that part of the world, that pocket of space, the solid region. I would call it a chamber. And maybe there are better terms for that, but suppose this is like a chamber. It's not chamber in the architectural sense because it's invisible, but it is real nevertheless. It is real in the sense that when I'm walking through that chamber, I don't have the experience outside of it, and I do have experience inside of it. So here for this simple exercise, this chamber is presented by this projection on the floor. And in the laboratory, we happen to study this sensitivity, the boundaries of sensitivity, using a variety of simplified patterns. But here you could see, this is great things, but here you could see a city or more complex patterns or plots, etc. So at least for the boundary of visibility, you could claim that from the science of physics, we could predict the boundary of visibility. And now I'm going to draw a map of some environment, and here my scientific exercise will stop, and then we'll examine implications of that. Okay, so here is, I call this rings of visibility, this model of perception for a mobile observer in a stationary environment. So suppose, again, this is plan view, and remember you are the red dot, and you are traveling along that trajectory in space. And here is some object or some feature of interest. So here you're traveling, and you want to understand where you're going to see that feature in a two-dimensional slice of the world, the plan view of the world. And here, remember, there's a fixed range of distances from which you can see that feature, which is represented here as an annulus, or a ring. The shaded part of the space is where you can see that feature. So from any location here, you'll be able to experience that and not experience that from outside. Now, notice this is an idealistic approach in the sense that when you are in this region, you could look in the opposite direction. Of course, you will not see this feature. What I'm trying to say is that there is this chamber in three-dimensional space, in solid space, from which you can see it if you want to, if you pay attention. Of course, we can make predictions for that when you pay attention or not, but I will not go that way for now. Let's just consider the ideal case that you do want to see that feature, and you'll be able to do that only from that region. And here is another feature represented by the white star on the left. And for that feature of the world, there is another ring of visibility represented in a lighter gray. So you're able to see it from two chambers as you travel along this trajectory. You will not see it here, see it, not see it, etc. Here's a more interesting experience of sort of intermittent scene. Imagine you're driving on a highway and there is a billboard or I don't know, something that you want to see. And here there are several locations for which you can see it. But the beauty of this approach is that you can predict it now. You can actually predict your first-person experience of that feature using a precise formulation, and we could predict it, and we could also, for example, by knowing whether you're tired or not, we would predict how your experience would change. Because when you're tired, your sensitivity would be lower, so the boundaries of this, the farther boundary of the ring of visibility will shrink slightly, so we could make all sorts of adjustments of that kind. We could also predict where in space you could see both of them, where you could have a joint experience at the beginning of talking about architectural ensemble, when you want to have several things taken in by the perceiver, you could predict it by just looking at where the two rings overlap. So here is the chunk of space where the two rings overlap, and this is the region of joint experience. So what we have accomplished is the beginning of understanding how to capture, how to predict your first-person experience of space in third-person terms. Back to our original question, what is space? There are many ways to think about it, and I would suggest that what I've just given you is a definition of space of experience. It's one of the possible definitions, but this is a very general definition of space of experience from intrinsically first-person point of view, even though I'm looking at it sort of from God's eye view, from above. So this definition of space here is the sequence of experiences. Space is given to you as sequence of experiences, even when you are not moving. Your head is moving, your eyes are moving, your attention is fluctuating. Your experience of space is always a sequence, I would argue, from this point of view. The advantage of this point of view is that I can formulate it precisely. I could test it in the laboratory and create the sort of software that I mentioned in the beginning for the architect, for the designer, architectural designer, lighting designer, or brand experience designer in trade shows. I would allow the designer to actually move things around in the software and comprehensively predict experiences of the environment. To measure that, to make this sort of prediction possible, we started in psychophysics. I mentioned the third-person point of view. We started in this format, and this is a complicated piece of electronics, which is now replaced by simply a small processor and a screen. And there, from the third-person point of view, we don't care about your experience in a phenomenal format. We don't want to ask you how you feel about it, whether you like it or not. We just present to you this grating, moving, say, up or down, and ask you on every presentation whether you see it move up or down. If the contrast is low, you don't see it and your responses are random. But if you do see them, your responses are correct. And this way, by varying contrast, you could discover the boundary of visibility, just as I showed you a few slides ago. And this way, you measure it in this very peculiar format of scientific laboratory, where I would call it cinematic format, because you are sitting, you are stationary. There is a screen, flat two-dimensional surface in front of you, at which you're looking, in a small, dark room, quite often on a chin rest. The situation is quite artificial, but I'm claiming from these highly artificial situations, we acquire this power to predict experience in a complex world, in architectural environments or any environment that you care about. So our goal now is to make this transition from the restricted conditions of the laboratory to the three-dimensional world. We call it immersive world. And we need that in order to convince you, the architects, that our predictions hold. That's where I started on this journey when I was explaining that to an architect in a project funded by the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, by Harold Hay grant that was given to me and two of my colleagues, an architect, Greg Lynn of University of California, Los Angeles, and a filmmaker, Alex McDowell. We received this grant in order to create a proof of concept, to show that our predictions in these very restricted environments, they translate into immersive world. So our goal is to translate first by scaling up, that's how we did it, and then by immersing the person in it. So what I mean by scaling up first, from the small images on the screen in the laboratory to something like this. The experiments were performed in Los Angeles in a studio called Architectural Robotics Laboratory. We got access to it thanks to Greg Lynn. It was built for architects to experience large structures, well, for students of architecture to experience large structures in the process of design. There are two industrial robots moving on the rails here. These are the two rails. What we did for these experiments, we just placed the person, the subject, as we call them in psychophysics. We placed the person in between the rails. We mount a projector on one robot and a screen on another robot. And we kept the distance between the two fixed, so the amount of light would not change. We did these experiments in darkness, for reasons I'll explain later. And here, we just had the subject sitting with a mouse in his hand. The two robots would move back and forth. And the stimuli, the patterns of the sort I showed you before, were presented on the screen. And every second, the computer would emit auditory sound or auditory signal when the subject hears the signal, he would respond whether or not, for example, he sees the pattern on the screen, or whether he sees the pattern moving left or right. So we developed the software for synchronizing movement of robots with presentation of images. And the way we defined it, that this was an experiment, an architectural sort of experiment, where we developed three themes. We created a measurable and repeatable space. We used large-scale animated patterns, and we synchronized with presentation of the patterns with movement of the robots. These were the specific challenges we had to face, and this is the setup. And you will see now movement of the screen and the observer. It's just a short movie. We did it in the dark because in the psychophysical experiment, you want to exactly control the contrast. You want to exactly control the contrast of your pattern, and illuminance changes the contrast and also changes the sensitivity. So everything was controlled precisely, correctly from a scientific point of view, even though we acquired the powers to make prediction for any kind of illuminance in realistic settings. So you see the subject here from the left, and the screen is moving towards him and away. It's a short movie, so we to get a sense how it was all set up. And here is how it looked in the analysis of these results. This is just a presentation of how the stimuli were rendered. So here is on the bottom, on the horizontal axis, this is the time of response from the beginning of experiment. This is in seconds. And vertical dimension, here on the left, it says distance in centimeters. So this is the distance between the screen where the patterns were presented and observer's eye. The robot would move the screen towards the eye and away, and it was a sort of repetitive excursion. And every time, every second, the computer would give the signal to the subject to respond, and these dots represent moments where the subject responded, given the signal. And then we collected the responses of the person for every distance. We averaged horizontally. So all these dots, for example, at 650 centimeters, we were in one bin, all the responses from 600 centimeters in another bin. This way we could measure visibility of the pattern for every distance. And here is just one snapshot of the results. Here on the right side, I show you a graph of visibility of the pattern on the vertical axis as a function of view and distance. So this curve, consider, for example, this curve in magenta, which says contrast 0.3%. So here, distance is changing from below 200 centimeters, below 2 meters, to something like 7 meters. And here on the vertical axis, I show that the pattern was invisible for distance of 2 to something like 4 meters. And then there was this transition, this rise of the curve, and the pattern was completely visible, started from distance of something like 550 centimeters. I show you this case because it's sort of paradoxical. Normally, you expect that the pattern would become invisible when you move it far away from the eye. Here, I show you the case where it becomes invisible when I move it closer to the eye. See, at shorter distances to the eye, you don't see it, and you see it at longer distances. And what's remarkable about this plot, I would argue, is that this transition is so abrupt. So between 450 and 550 centimeters, you go from complete invisibility to complete visibility. This is the boundary, I call it near wall of that invisible chamber. This is the first example of how we can measure and then predict those chambers I was talking about. And the abrupt transition means that, for example, when I walk through space and I approach the boundary of that chamber, that near wall, I approach the boundary and I make one step, and I move from having the experience, from not having the experience to having the experience. Just this one step, half pace, will give me access to this information. This is the first time that we're able to to make this translation from the artificial laboratory conditions to still rather artificial, but large-scale conditions similar to that of the immersive environment. The next step, of course, is to create a complete immersive mode, and that's what we're doing now. Here is a person in a suit used to track the movement of the person, wearing a head-mounted display with virtual reality of some built environment. He's wearing an EEG cap so that his cortical activity, activity of his brain is monitored, and all sorts of other biomarkers on his body, so that we could measure responses of the person to the environment, to the immersive environment, other than visibility alone. So, and this way we could gradually reconstruct these maps, which were presented to us by Arnheim in a very sort of descriptive, qualitative, speculative language. We could derive these maps in the language of science, like physics in this case, or other, using other measures of the brain activity. We could employ different parts of neuroscience to describe these maps, not only for visual sense. So this is the beginning of describing subjective first-person experience using objective means, I would argue. And I would like to stop here just to summarize briefly. We have developed essentially over centuries a sophisticated conception of space of intellect. I call it space of intellect. You could think of that space of geometry or physics. And now we are making first steps to understand the space of experience, which have remained an unknown territory because of its deceptive accessibility. This is the Merleau-Ponty's point of view. I described the conception of the space of experience defined in terms of access to features of the environment, allowing one to design sequence of experiences in a continuous solid field in immersive mode. Measured objectively, quantitatively, and thus investing designer with predictive powers, which is a new capability for any kind of design of special experiences. And I would argue that this way we open a new domain of inquiry, which allows us to conquer the space of experience with immediate applications, architectural and lighting design, city planning, immersive cinema, brand experience, game design, etc. So this is a number of professions interested in design of experiences, and we are beginning to develop predictive powers for all of these professions. And here in conclusion, I show you this map of what we call spatial arts. This map I derived together with filmmaker Alex McDowell, who I mentioned before. This is an attempt to understand how different arts or kinds of practice approach the question of spatial experience in history. And I think I will just briefly describe this map, and then I will stop and we'll open the debate. So here we show this progression from prehistoric times, this proverbial cave. And here from there, we developed a number of abilities to design our environment, and we created multiple professions specializing in these abilities. Architecture is just one of them, which is one of the most ancient professions. But theater, for example, is another ancient art, form of practice, which has to do with spatial experience. And their situation is very interesting because in theater, for example, proscenium presents you with this boundary between two kinds of space. One space is the physical, which you share with your fellow spectators, and there is this space, imaginary space, because on the scene, on the stage, you would have a different historical period, or it could be a magical space of any kind. This is an interesting case where you may want to explore boundaries, not in terms of experience, but in terms of change in the narrative, the nature of narrative. Then consider, for example, the variety of arts. I could call them projected arts, two-dimensional screen-based arts, such as photography and visual arts, where you develop sophisticated language for creating experience of immersion. In cinema, of course, you know very well that you are seated at a fixed distance from the screen, but you have a very strong sense of being immersed in whatever happens on the screen and how it happens, and why filmmakers chose one method over another in order to create an experience, I think is a source of insight for our understanding of this partitioning of space. And then, of course, games, which is I would say, it happens to be in modern video computer games, is the most sophisticated medium for our conversation, because there you already for years you have immersion. Some of the games exist in virtual reality. You already have this this dynamic relationship between the person and whatever environment he is immersed in. And game designer has already thought about all kinds of sort of relationship that the person could have with an environment in this fully controlled medium. So I think game designers could give a lot of insight to us in terms of design of experiences in this three-dimensional medium, including architecture and theater. To do that, as Tatiana mentioned, we just recently built a center at University of Southern California called Center for Spatial Perception and Concrete Experience, abbreviated SPACE. Here is the website on the bottom. Please visit it to see what we propose to do there. We are trying to use this methodology that I described in order to explore the entire range of the spatial arts. Concrete here, of course, it's a term borrowed from a different branch of science. It's mathematics, where concrete is used as a sort of a portmanteau for continuous and discrete, because we are trying to understand how to design augmented environments where continuous world, physical world, is mixed with synthetic and digital world, continuous and discrete. Here on the right, I show some of the themes we're going to explore there, but please visit the site if you want to learn more about this. And I will stop here, and we'll have a discussion now. In case you have some questions that you want to send me, or some comments or suggestions, please use this email address. It's my address at the Salk Institute. I will try to respond within a reasonable time. And thank you so much for your attention. Now, to structure our discussion, we could do it this way. I would suggest that you ask me any questions if you have any at this point. And then we have a number of themes that we could discuss. And when we exhaust the immediate questions, we could delve into those themes. And along the way, I will try to monitor our live chat channel that will hopefully allow us to receive questions from the cloud. Are there any questions from the cloud here? Yeah. Either we can access it or we don't have questions. But yeah, let's start with your questions here, please.
So thank you for such an illuminating lecture. My question is about the representation of architecture and design process. So when we teach design in the studio, of course, we have our traditional methods of representation. We have the plan, the section, the elevation. We use digital and physical models. Recently, we've used quite a bit of animation. We don't have access in most design schools yet to VR in the studio. Perhaps later on we will. But I wanted to ask if you imagine that we will really need to completely reimagine methods of representation when we teach architecture, and of course when we practice architecture, in order to really begin to use some of these strategies and to begin to predict experience, and most importantly, to bring in the dimension of time in the design process.
Thank you, Tatiana. This is a wonderful question, rather a series of questions. I could take another hour answering those, but I'll try to be brief. About the practice of teaching architecture, I have a little bit of experience there, trying to teach here for the certificate of neuroscience and architecture, the new school. I would argue that indeed there is room for new strategies of teaching, given the sort of approach that I described. I would not say we need to reimagine it completely, just like cinema didn't completely erase theater. New technologies do not erase previous technologies. The immersive cinema of the future will not make the cinema of today obsolete. I think adding new level of insight into experience will allow us to enrich the palette of tools for teaching. The strategy of design could change if you knew exactly how experience is going to be structured. And teaching that, I think, is important, because an architect who is already trained to design in a particular way would find it difficult to switch. In reality, of course, every design of experience is already trying to design actual experience. As you design where the walls are, what textures to put there, etc., of course, what you want to create is an experience of particular kind. You care about texture and the particular shape of the wall only to the extent that it will create a certain experience outside, of course, of engineering concerns. So this ability to map experiences will give the architect new powers in predicting experience, and that will require a new strategy of design. How to do that is an interesting question. So what I showed you is just one example of how experience could be represented in terms of a map of experience. As we proceed in our research, I'm sure we'll come up with other representations. And I would, of course, advise educators of architecture to try and incorporate this kind of insight into education of an architect or any other kind of spatial designer. The other part of your question has to do with time. This is a related but different, very important question. From what I can see, architects are mostly trained in static media. We have these plans and sections and all that. They, of course, don't give you a good sense of how the experience, dynamic experience, will feel to the person. Of course, experienced architect has that movie playing in his or her mind, but of course there are tools today to visualize that. And these fly-through animations that you see quite often in architectural practice when the project is presented to the client, those are first attempts to do that, but from the point of view of a perceptual scientist, I would say that these animations are rather imperfect, that they are, this is a radically new medium, and architects trying to use that don't know quite well how to do that yet. Just imagine the art of representation of three-dimensional scenes on a two-dimensional surface has been developed and practiced for hundreds of years. A crucial transition in that domain, invention of perspective in Quattrocento, Italy, was a radical change, not only in architecture, but allegedly this change propagated through the entire corpus of Western culture, for example. We're talking about Western culture. I expect transitions of that caliber, changes, cultural changes of that caliber will happen also in the domain of temporal media. I don't want to compare myself with Brunelleschi or Alberti, but maybe what I'm doing is something similar to what they were doing. We are beginning to understand representational media for explaining immersive environments. So dimension of time is very important, and in that respect, I also think architectural education could change. Maybe some schools already practice that. Students could take videos and working with perceptual scientists, for example, could help them to take into account certain nuances of perception that they would not be aware of from their sort of phenomenological first-person perspective. Yes, please.
Lloyd, you framed your presentation in a very specific way, where you started to define the first person and the phenomenological, and then separately you said there's another category of possibility that we're going to define as the third person or physical.
Mm-hmm.
And having set that framework, then as you moved into the second part of the presentation, you said that your own preferred interested study is standing in the area of the third person, mm-hmm. and trying to say what we can say in a more objective manner about the first person. Mm-hmm. So that's what I understood from what I heard.
Yes, yeah.
And so the question is this, that I think just because of my own background and my own peculiarities, that I've kind of come at it from totally the opposite way, where I understand science and physics, I understand a certain amount about philosophy, and the question then is, are you aware of people right now on the other side who are coming from the first person to the third person? Because you did mention some examples historically, going back 100 years or 150 years. Are you aware of anyone working in that area right now?
Yes,
whose work
yes,
interests you?
yes. So with the roots in phenomenology, there is a large community of phenomenological philosophers developing this theme. Remember in the beginning I had a slide where I showed this division between space of intellect and space of experience. On the left side there, there was this image of one book with the title having to do with place. So elaborating the difference between space and place is one of the areas where they work. But being philosophers, they're using language which is absolutely very useful for understanding the distinction. But that language doesn't give you predictive powers. So I think it is important to listen to phenomenologists for a scientist, because the questions that the scientist would ask would come from phenomenology. And so this is one aspect of this connection. The second is historically, philosophy is the area of knowledge or inquiry where questions and concepts are investigated to the threshold of scientific research. So what used to be natural philosophy became productive science, in some cases positive science, in some cases just empirical science. But philosophy is the source of ideas for scientific inquiry in a more general sense. So what I would suggest that what we are doing now in our investigation of the structure of experience, we are taking some bits of architectural discourse, of phenomenological discourse, and translate them into scientific language and present them in a manner which is accessible to the architect or designer of any other kind interested to incorporate that into their practice. But this conversation will continue going, I think. And I personally am very interested in phenomenology. Merleau-Ponty, for example, one of my favorite philosophers, and I keep coming back to him for seeking help and formulating my questions more precisely.
Yeah, well, just if I could follow up briefly, I think that there were periods in time when moving this into a discussion about architecture and not into completely high levels of abstraction, that, for example, you can look at an architect 100 years ago, somebody like Louis Sullivan, who thought in very philosophical terms, and he wrote a magnificent, elaborate book called A Study of Ornament, Geometrical Forms in Relation to Man's Powers. And so he had coming at, he had some very specific things that he was trying to get across. And how successful that was is, I think, open question. But the point is that over the years, that completely fell out of fashion. And nobody was interested in architecturally. This is just a pure curiosity, very pretty, but just a pure curiosity. And so I think that one of the reasons why I personally happen to be interested in Louis Kahn is I think that was an unrecognized aspect of Louis Kahn's career, where he was deliberately dabbling in that. But it's unfashionable, and so paying attention to that has kind of fallen by the wayside.
Yeah, I see.
And the question gets to be, are there ways of capturing that? And I have the suspicion that there are, but you know, what's more interesting at this point is not hearing my point of view, but hearing what other people may have been concerned with in this area.
Let me try to answer your question, and then I'll return the question to the audience. So I agree with you that this domain of architectural theory is very important. I think what you're talking about, the architectural theory, trying to come up with general principles which are in the hands of an architect are probably very different from sort of third-person scientific approach. I've been trying to investigate this domain of architectural theory. In most cases, I find the starting point for the argument rather arbitrary. The systems that an architect comes up with are interesting and are revealing about his or her way of thinking, but as a systematic framework that scientists would find appealing for developing these predictive powers, in most cases, it's not satisfactory. So you could see a variety of geometric approaches where people are trying to come up with ideas from, say, crystallography, or from sort of identifying a kind of geometry that they believe is suitable for framing architectural discourse. Some of these discourses are more profound than others, but they're not grounded in understanding of experience of the kind that the scientist will find satisfactory. And the systems range from, for example, a pattern language of Christopher Alexander to more poetic discourses such as this, the Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard. And one reason that I'm saying this is that the distance that we're talking about is enormous. Just think about the continuum. Poetics of Space on one end by Gaston Bachelard, and a book on what we call physiological optics in the sciences. The distance is enormous. It's either enormous. And maybe it's not simply a distance between remote entities. Maybe these are different planes. These are different levels of universes of discourse. As mathematicians have termed for that, universes of discourse, where you just cannot find a common language. Bachelard happens to be at his source. He happens to be historian and philosopher of science. That's where he made his name before he started to write these fascinating books on the juncture of phenomenology and psychoanalysis, talking about phenomenology of fire, of dwelling place. So he as you mentioned, he is an example of a thinker, a theoretician of architecture, with a background in the science. But he came to that end, and he developed a language which many of my friends, scientists, interested in the relationship between neuroscience and architecture, find completely comprehensible. So one of my friends, for example, described the work of Bachelard in following terms. He would open the book of Bachelard and read his accounts, and he would see how Bachelard is about to say something important about experience of architecture. But my friend would keep reading the book and keep seeing Bachelard promising to say something important and actually never getting there. This is the kind of response that you get from a scientist trying to read phenomenological literature of architecture. And of course, on the other side, quite often, I've been giving talks like this, I would have a questioner, or someone to write an email that would sort of reduce to something like this. Thank you so much for giving this talk, for giving your time. It was a fascinating conversation. But you cannot begin understanding architectural experience before you come to terms in the mystical qualities of space. I got this, last year I got an email like this. And as a scientist, I cannot translate his question into anything that I could answer. But as someone interested in phenomenology and having read Bachelard, I think I understand what he's talking about. Even though we don't have a language for bridging that distance, I think given this frameworks that I described, when we understand partitioning of experience, we are beginning to demystify space. We could talk about mystical qualities of space if you like, but let me ask if anybody else here is concerned with this particular issue of distance between disciplines. Please, Eduardo.
Sergei, what you just brought up, this idea of this around space, it may be that what what people are seeing is an oversimplification. In order to come together, let's say you're simplifying in order to be able to do an experiment, to the extent that the experience of the space, which are totally focusing on visual at this point, is something that no one experiences. Because we experience space in many different stimuli channels. And in addition to that, time is extremely critical. And the way we scan the visual image is also a confusing factor. Because the fact is that what we see is a construct of a sequence of micro images on our fovea.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So we're moving around and we create a representation in which basically the time dimension, right? I mean, the guy, this, I forget.
It's Mach, Ernst Mach.
Okay, Ernst Mach is sitting there, right? And he is looking and drawing, right? So purposely he fixes space.
Exactly.
But the real experience of space is one in which we're always in motion because our eyes are never stopped.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And so the reconstruction, I mean, the way you were proposing it is that we can see this boundary between that is created by contrast versus frequency. The fact is that we are scanning space all the time with filters, in which some of the filters are low frequency, some are high frequency.
Indeed.
Right?
Yeah.
And the contrast is being determined by the amount of light getting through the pupil.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
There is a complexity there that maybe, you know, people coming from the side of the phenomenologists are saying, you're oversimplifying. You can't possibly.
Indeed, and most likely they will do that.
Experiences.
Indeed. And then I think this is often the case when you introduce a scientific concept which captures some of the ideas of a more complex philosophical discipline, you will be perceived as simplifying it. But entering this domain from a scientific angle requires some sort of simplification of this kind. And Eduardo, I couldn't agree more with you about the notion that this drawing by Mach is, of course, already a kind of space of intellect. Movement is, this is the point I was trying to make using Gibson's drawings. Gibson was trying to reproduce the same idea. Of course, each frame of this sequence is also filtered through intellect, because in reality, what is given to you in high resolution is a very small window. The window, so in vision science, we quantify things in terms of visual angle. So 1 degree of visual angle is roughly the size of your thumbnail at the distance of extended hand. So this, this distance here is about 1 visual angle. You have a high resolution view of the world through the aperture of maybe 2-3 degrees. So maybe at this distance. This is my aperture of high resolution. The scientist who studies vision knows that your input, the input from the light from the world into a visual system is this tiny channel. And now eyes are moving continuously, that was Eduardo was talking about, in order to sample information. This is not given, this information, this insight is not given to phenomenologists, because however far you want to reduce your experience, you will always have a sense of high resolution world given to you in every location. So you start with an illusion. And when Eduardo, you're talking about what really happens, I am always trying to figure in this sort of conversations what real means. It's as if there is one single reality, but reality is a difficult concept philosophically. There's the reality of the world of the scientist, that's what we are talking about now, the reality which is not given to a person from the first person perspective, ever. And maybe this is one of the issues at the juncture between the two worlds that Patočka was talking about in the beginning of my talk. Remember, I mentioned the Patočka's view of the spiritual crisis that we experience today because we really live in two worlds. Every one of us, even non-scientists, are sort of familiar with certain scientific ideas. The concept of physical space, or outer space, the so-called outer space, is of course familiar to everyone. Our attempts to talk about space, to have conversation about space, are always contaminated by these ideas from the intellect. But it's never complete because the nature of that space, the real space, if you wish, is known only to a small number of physicists who have tremendous difficulties explaining to lay people or physicists even from other disciplines what the heck that is. So reality is multi-layered, and the one way to think about it is in terms of these worlds. There's a first-person world and the third-person world. And as I like this expression, I think it's from, where did I see that? Maybe this is that book of Sarah Bakewell about existentialism. She said that people are worlded creatures, worlded. That is, every one of us is sort of encased in the world. And if you're an architect, you have a world different from a world of the scientist. And when we talk to each other, we have some common terms, but our picture of the world is different. And it will not take very long for a scientist and architect, please, for a science and an architect to discover those discrepancies. And this is what happens in this conversation between neuroscience and architecture. And I think by collaborative projects of this kind, we are beginning to forge the new language, maybe a new world, which is different from architectural discourse and from scientific discourse. Maybe that new discipline I was talking about, the new domain of inquiry, will create this new bubble here on the boundary that will be neither scientific nor phenomenological, but a new way of thinking about this domain of spatial experience to begin. I hope I've answered the question.
No, you didn't, but you raised many others. You know,
I know.
That's I think the beauty of being in this boundary, that in fact there's so many interesting things to think about. I mean, we didn't talk a lot about, scanning, but attention can really bias that percept that you're creating as you scan. And you could bias that, make it a little more complicated by having sound also.
Yes, this question I was trying to address in the middle of my talk. Remember, I mentioned those rings. When I described these rings, I was talking about ideal observer sort of approach, in the sense that under best conditions, if you're already interested in that feature presented by the star, if you're already looking for it and you're looking in the right direction to pay attention to it, these are the best conditions under which you'll be able to see the feature only when you're inside those chambers, and that particular ring, for example. The description that I gave you depends on contrast sensitivity, the boundary between visible and visible, and we already know from laboratory research how that boundary fluctuates as a function of attention. So we can even predict where the boundaries are if you're not looking at that feature, but looking away from it, because we know how it changes in the periphery. We could also predict what happens under conditions of inattention. Oh, there are questions coming here. Thank you so much. You could predict that. What I showed you is just the first sketch, but in that framework, I think we can address questions of boundaries under peripheral vision and under inattention. But I think this is as far as we can get. There's a number of questions coming from the cloud. Should we address those questions, or would you like to ask something else before we delve there? Please.
I would like just to add something to what you said, because I think there's something interesting about each experience that's really complex. And again, there's 1,000 questions we can ask here, but maybe it would be interesting, like you start to suggest that we start to map a sequence of experiences. So we need to start to see how those mapping of experiences look like. For each experience, we have a different map, and I'm assuming many layers of complexity. And I think we need to start to bridge these practices
Yes.
of living out really parallelly and together. And what I think it will be helpful is to, I'm sure somebody out there does that, is to have a map of the brain or a map of perceptions, because you can map all experiences. Yeah, each experience is different and time related. And so anyway, I'm curious if we are in the stage to start to map a complex experience and to see how this map looks like.
Yeah, so what I showed you, that map is two rings. It's just an illustration of a principle. Given that principle, we could take any scene and map it out right away. The point of the experiment that we did with architectural robotics was to validate our model. So the model about the boundary of experience is derived from this cinematic mode of experiment, where you are sitting at a fixed distance from the screen. We want to prove first that the results we obtained in these highly controlled conditions apply in complex reality.
So getting map the perceptions, though, we have those also visibility.
Of certain features.
So that's one layer.
It is,
yeah.
It is a visual layer.
Yes.
It's about visual perception only, and it's only about specific features and only about visibility of that features. What happens inside those boundaries, it's not touched by our approach, but what you have is sort of a framework in which you could start asking questions about experience within the boundary. So it's an approach of first defining where the experience is possible and presenting you with a possibility to make the next step, to perform phenomenological analysis when you're inside that chamber, for example.
I think it's very important that you think of the next step really quickly in the bigger picture, because you need to bridge that thing. Even the way the two books, the fact that you have the artistic point of view and the scientific point of view, for us as architects, this is so important. I remember talking to Helena a while back. It's so sometimes we don't map it, but we know it. We are also artists, and there is an element there that's very important to be taken into consideration.
Yeah,
and everybody feels
yes.
about it.
I
Anyway,
agree with you.
It's a complex topic.
It is a separate layer of analysis, and I would argue that before you talk about artistic quality of experience, you want to know where the experience is possible to begin with, and that's where we start.
Just a note on that, and then probably it's better to answer those questions, is it's interesting to see how other disciplines that weren't in your map, the map from the cave to the post-cinematic, are dealing with experience in non-scientific ways, that starting from design inquiries, because every other discipline is moving to experience, especially industrial design and interactive design of digital products, right? They all just trying to design according to the user experience. So there's a huge chapter of the study of design written about how to map, how to deal with the design, thinking about an experience, not the object, okay? And it's very interesting because it moved, the first step was the sequence. It was the temporal element, the time element.
Yes.
And it was like changing the way we represent objects in sequence of and storyboarding, right? So just stupid elements that I'm putting on the table. But that is very interesting because it reflects exactly the same need of seeing things from a perspective of the experience instead of the artifacts.
Yes, yes.
So, and then they moved into a total different category, I would say, that is not scientific probably, but is very much based on empirical observation of and involvement of users and human beings into the design process or to test the design in a way that is totally empirical. So what everybody's doing nowadays is basically design, test the design, going backward, because they try to measure, instead of measuring the emotional reactions or the experience reaction of people, they try to just taste it and just find what is good or bad for the most or for the specific audience, and they put it back into the design. So it's a very different perspective, but the same thing is that design is dealing with the higher level of complexity, no matter what you're designing.
Mhm.
And this is for sure, back to the point, a need that we feel as a discipline to deal with complexity, trying to simplify and to come to a conclusion that is not right or wrong.
Mhm.
This is very important to say, because science doesn't have to put this idea that we can do it right or wrong, because there's no right building or wrong building. There's ugly buildings full of, there's very uncomfortable or dysfunctional buildings.
Mhm.
So you can measure now what is good or bad, but not right or wrong, okay? So we are in a qualitative environment,
Yes.
definitely, that is very much in the phenomenological way of seeing is for us is more natural.
Yeah.
Like I don't call it artistic. I call it like for us it's like we study perception,
First-person perspective.
right? So we study element and principle. We know what rhythm, contrast, value bring to our artifacts. We studied it. We studied Gestalt as the grammar, right?
Yeah.
So it's very important to try to step to the level of complexity that the experiential model is bringing in all the disciplines on the different categories and words of.
Yes.
And I find it very fascinating because it's really interesting how from a professional perspective, now designers of these kinds of objects, like digital objects, are trying to find the predictive way of their power, trying to measure what's the effect of the design on human beings to sell their design.
Yes.
Eye tracking, all these experiments that people are doing on websites, for instance, so where people fix the eyes for how long, where do your attention goes on a web page, where do you click,
Yes.
right? To a point in which like, do I have to be measured every time I go in a website to buy, it's kind of, it's a lot.
Yeah, so to answer your question and to continue answering Daniela's question, I would like to say that what happens in this process is reducing the complexity for designer.
Yeah.
So the designer will have to do with variety of dimensions of experience. By having one aspect of dimension of experience removed, sort of reduced, or maybe I would say trivialized,
Yeah.
by having complete understanding of it, will make your task easier. So rather than removing, sort of taking creative powers from you, I think what we are doing now, we are releasing your creative powers. That is, we reduce the cognitive load on the designer, try to think about everything at the same time. For example, when you have the map of experience of the sort I was talking about, which could be rather complex, but still intelligible, we would free your mind to focus on other aspects of design. In case of architectural design, it's removing the concern about whether the experience you're interested in holds from a different angle. By giving you a map, we will give you complete knowledge of whether the experience holds from different directions, so you could think about other parts of this very complex picture, qualitative picture you're talking about. And Gil, you had a question.
Given the time, I just assume here you wrap it up. Are you have questions from abroad also?
There is a number of questions from the.
Take one of those.
Yeah, so here they're on the screen. Is it possible to get a copy of this presentation? I don't know. The website will give them access to the slides. We could. Yeah, if you're interested, please send email to me or the organizer. Is there an email on the website? Yeah, please send the email one way or another, and we will give you a copy, PDF print of the slides. Next question. This is a great content on how people gather information about their surroundings. Thank you. How do you incorporate a person's individual reaction, which is based on their unique life's experience? Yeah, this is one of the layers that Daniela was talking about. Well, unique life's experience is a dimension which stands above basic sensory experience. That is, certain aspects of visual perception are uniform or universal. They are predictable from our models. The boundary of visibility that I was talking about is to a large degree conserved through most of person's lifespan. That is, the particular visual abilities are acquired very, very early in your life, and they sort of fade away very late in your life. So for majority of humanity, coming from different cultures, having different linguistic backgrounds and professional backgrounds, we could assume safely that the boundaries will be roughly the same within certain margin of error. And that's what we do in the laboratory. We discover that margin of error. And this is true because we're talking about very basic, sort of low-level aspect of visual perception. When you talk about high-level aspects, such as your memories, your ability to recognize certain object as, for example, a sacred object, it's a higher level, higher sort of realm, which we don't touch in this discourse so far. What we do, we tell you where you're going to access this experience, but the content of experience is, of course, is outside of our model. Next question, what is the name of the book the QA person is speaking of? Question and answer sector we're talking. Well, one book I was talking about is, it's called The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard, a French philosopher of science and phenomenologist, working on in a very unusual mode on the boundary of psychoanalysis and phenomenology. It's a poetic book. It's very removed from science, but Bachelard is interested in every aspect. I would recommend you study Bachelard. Mach, for example, I mentioned Mach, one of the early investigators of perception. This is the book published in German in the late 20th century called Contributions to the Analysis of the Sensations. This is one of the sources of our modern understanding of perception. Another important source is this book by philosopher Franz Brentano. The entire corpus of phenomenology and experimental phenomenology arose from the circle of pupils of Brentano. Franz Brentano was a professor of philosophy at University of Würzburg and then Vienna. There's a variety of books that I would recommend. This is the one by Merleau-Ponty, which I cited from, which I cited. The magnum opus of Merleau-Ponty is called Phenomenology of Perception. It is remarkable. It's a landmark in the history of this question, but it's rather complex. If you want sort of short overview of the ideas, I recommend to read this. It's called The World of Perception. This is English translation of the lectures that Merleau-Ponty gave on French radio in 1948, I believe, 49. This is a sort of a summary of his rather sophisticated philosophy of the body. And here is another remarkable book. I quoted from it too. It's by Jan Patočka, Czech phenomenological philosopher. Here is the book. It's partly covered by this label. The title is covered. The book is called The Natural World as a Philosophical Problem. That's where he's talking about spiritual crisis and the disunion between the worldviews. So I recommend you to consult all these books. There is large literature on experience of space, starting from another book by Ernst Mach. It's called Space and Geometry. Ernst Mach is the physicist and philosopher whom I mentioned in the beginning. Remember that drawing of his left eye? This book is available online in PDF, but you could get this very small copy from Amazon. So these are all foundational texts for what we are talking about. Of course, there are modern books which are narrower and more technical. Further questions? Please repeat the name of the first book. The first book is called The Poetics of Space. The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard. And I think, how do you imagine other senses than visual perception would affect the experience in general? This is a very important question. If I try to cover other senses, I would speak for at least 5 hours. Of course, our experience of any environment is multidimensional, multisensory, and not only that. So, of course, we could come up with a map like this for auditory perception, say, but there is other altogether different aspect of this experience on the motor side. So on the sensory side, we have visual maps and maps coming from other senses. But there is also a motor aspect. We call it motor in the sciences. It has to do with action. So the junction between those two is called sensory motor coordination. You could also define space as a category from the motoric point of view, from the point of view of action, because space is an opportunity for movement. Someone defined space as movement. Was it you, Mike? No?
Marvin.
It was movement. It is a beginning of definition from the motoric point of view, because space gives you and constrains your possibility to move through it. And if I try to map space in that domain of action, I would start with different principles, and the maps would look differently. But of course, this is a very important question, and we eventually will have to construct maps for multiple senses and for action as well. And there are no more questions here, please, Laura.
So, when you talked about your concentric circles, your chambers, and you talked about how if you have one star, you have a certain chamber and you can access it from a certain point of view, experience that. And you added a second star, and then you looked at where they intersected. So you now had a reduced chamber, but it was experiencing both of them.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, are you able to model the effect of the second star on the perception of the first? Not necessarily are you able to see them both at the same time, but every time you add a new object, you are influencing perception of the existing objects. And as you add a third and a fourth and other components other than visual, all of a sudden your experience changes.
Yes, it's a very important dimension as well. And even when information coming from the same site, so what you're talking about is the case where you have two sources, and when you are between them, sort of you have the capacity to experience one and another. In this case, you have to actually mature. Of course, you could think of a case where they're closer by and they both pinch in your sensory systems. They create experiences together from the same direction. And that case was investigated to great length by Gestalt School of Experimental Phenomenology. This is the so-called contextual interactions. And of course, your experience of any feature depends on presence of other features. So for example, in case of boundaries of perception, an oriented feature could be invisible in itself, but when you add other elements which are collinear or having the same curvature as the feature of interest, it will become visible. So that boundary, I'm not talking about more complex issues of how the quality of your experience depends on presence of other features. Here I'm talking about the same sort of entry level of complexity, about boundary of experience. That the boundary for that feature will depend on whether it's present in a certain context or not.
So you're talking about detection, basically, as opposed to an experience, a higher cognitive.
Yeah. Detection is the beginning of experience, because outside of it, I think this is the necessary first step. Before you consider the qualities of experience, you want to know what enters the qualities. Because the same painting, remember the painting of Dali, the painting, your description of the very complex experience, you see one person or then another person, that experience, of course, depends on whether or not you see this person or another. This is kind of this is an example of that trivialization. When we put it in these very simple terms, it almost becomes uninteresting, especially if you're very artistic, becomes boring. But this is, I think that's my goal, is to take certain aspects of experience and trivialize them, to make them certainly very clear and predictable, and take them outside of your domain of worry, so you would free your powers to do something else. Yeah, Gil, please.
Yeah, kind of a simple question, but in your experiment with the screen, it moved closer to the person. What is the real difference in terms of what is happening in terms of that person's perception than if you just had a giant screen and you projected the same experience on that screen?
And you're walking towards it, or rather than?
No, you're in a still position.
Oh, I see.
So is the movement is what happens, or is the expansion of that space, because we're talking about a single dimension, obviously if you closed in on four sides, you're really then creating a space.
Well, there will be difference in experience, of course. But I don't think the difference in, there will be difference in boundary of experience. So that we need to make a distinction here. When you're looking at a pattern at a fixed distance, and for example, you walk towards the pattern. Suppose you have a stationary screen, you're walking towards it. If the pattern presented on the screen is static, then the boundary will be visible from the case where the pattern is moving. And we know that from our experiments in psychophysics. The same boundary will be found in the case where you are stationary and the screen is moving towards you, and the pattern presented on the screen is moving. The boundary will be the same. They're not the same experiments, because in one case the person is static, in another case the person is moving. And for the case of the boundary derived from contrast sensitivity, I would expect the boundary would be the same. But in other cases, the boundary will be different because our brain is performing this calculation all the time. As I mentioned at the very beginning, remember when I spoke about Gibson, James J. Gibson, our brain is constantly computing, so to speak. What is the source of motion? Is the source of motion your own movement, or it is in the world? Because as we mentioned, our body is never still. You move your head, you move your eyes, you blink, and there is this microsaccades, very small amplitude eye movements. So the image presented on your retina is ever moving. It's extremely difficult to create an image on your retina in laboratory conditions that is completely still. So because of this perpetual movement, the brain is taking care in figuring at every single moment what is moving, and some aspects of experience will be affected by the quality of that. The effect of that process is called constancy, perceptual constancy. So for example, this object, it's a sort of a box, it's a parallelepiped geometrically. So as I rotate it in front of me, the projection on my retina is constantly changing, of course. Here it's just a rectangle, here's a different rectangle. But my system, my visual system, is continuously computing the three-dimensional shape of it. So in my experience, I achieve a constancy of shape. So even though images presented on my retina are continuously changing, I have an experience of constant shape. So some of these constancies are imperfect. And knowing which are perfect or not, that is, in some cases, the brain is capable to recover the sort of quote-unquote true shape of this object. In other cases not. Knowing where the boundary of that capability is will affect your perception. So it's a long answer, but this is the complex reality, even in the simple case of discovering the boundary. Okay, so I think we should stop here. Well, thank you so much again for coming. We continue.